means you're all in the ark. You're in a good place. Glad you're here this morning. Welcome to Sunday School, and glad you made it a choice to participate with us this morning. You know, it's the month of June. We're celebrating the end of the school year. Some of you who have children, you're like, yes, school is over, and some of you are excited because it's the unofficial start of summer, and we definitely had a good kickoff day yesterday for sure, so we were blessed. And as you can see, we're going to be talking about Paul today, but it's important that we catch the verse of the month, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 12. We'll spend a lot of time talking about 1 Thessalonians 2 next week, but this is the verse of the month, that you would walk worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. So I underlined two words there, walking worthy. So important, isn't it, that we stay in this journey together and we're walking together in harmony and in unity, and so that we can make a difference in the world in which we live. Well, let's talk about, everybody in the room probably knows Paul, so let's talk a little bit about him today. And since our focus is on this overview, it's sort of a character study, we'll hit on some highlights. We won't go in too much detail, but it'll be enough to help you understand who he was. The components of our lesson are there. We'll introduce Paul, we'll do some key events in his life, we'll talk about some life lessons, and then we'll talk about ways that we can respond. We hear about Paul all the time, and it is important that we understand that we can learn a few things from his life. We may not all be missionaries to, different places, and we may not all have a ministry like Paul's as we read it in the scriptures, but we all can have an influence, and I think that's where I want to take you this morning. We're going to see how God saved Paul. He was an enemy of the faith, so we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. And yet he was used in a great way. Why is this important for us? Because each one of us has the potential to be used by God. One of our primary objectives is to see how God can use anyone in his service. Logan shares a song sometimes, God Saves Poor Sinners. That was written in 2005 by a guy named Paul Williams, and it's one of those songs. It's a Southern gospel song. The McCameys and the Victory Trio, they did that song, gave it some latitude, but it is truly, if you read the lyrics, it is really about the fact that, God came to take care of me, to save me, to make a difference in my life. And he can do the same for you as well. Well, who was Paul? First of all, let's start out by understanding that his real name in the beginning was Saul. And he was born to Jewish parents from the tribe of Benjamin. You'll find that in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 5. He describes himself as a Hebrew of the Hebrews. So he is this Jewish person. And then he was born in this city called Tarsus, and we'll talk a little more about that in just a few moments. And it allowed him to be a Roman citizen. So you'll find that in Acts chapter 22, verses 24 through 29. And he reveals this of his birth and his Roman citizenship when he's about to be punished for sharing the gospel message. He was single, or at least at the time he wrote this in 1 Corinthians. There's some debate. You read about it. It's like, okay, was he single? Was he not? Was he widowed? But in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 8 through 9, you find that he says to the church at Corinth, I wish that you were as I am. And that is so that you would stay unmarried and be able to minister, because he knew that he could be much more effective in his work. He wrote 13 of the New Testament books, so the majority, not the majority, there's 27, so he wrote almost half of the New Testament. And then he worked hard, he traveled, if you read about him, you'll find that he traveled almost 7,000 miles. And that's before you've got, airplanes and cars and trains and buses. So he did a lot to spread the gospel in his day. We recognize him as a missionary, and I was looking at our missionary board back there, and we support a number of missionaries. The offering that's taken up during Sunday school is a faith offering, and it is for missionary work. So if you wonder, well, what is this offering all about? It is to support missionaries that the church is engaged with. But a missionary is someone who goes somewhere, and this is interesting, and you may say, well, what is a missionary? A missionary is someone who goes to promote faith. But that's not all they do. And sometimes, our missionaries are doing a good work. They also provide services, education. They do literacy training. So if you looked at the Baileys back there on our board back there, you'll see that they're in Japan and they have classes so that people can learn how, to survive in their own culture, if you will, but also learn about God. And then they provide social services. They provide health care. I'm excited. My son, he is actually on a missions journey right now. He's in Costa Rica. And so it's a big deal, to be able to go and learn and help. And I think the one key for me, as I'm reading the bulletin board back there, is the fact that folks that go learn more than what they share at times, or at least that's what they say. So we'll see. And did you know that Paul planted 14 churches? That's about what we have record of. He's ministered in almost 20 if you read about him. And so he was a very active person. Well, let's get into some of the key events of his life. First of all, before his conversion, Saul persecuted followers of Christ. You find this in Acts chapter 7, verses 58, and then again 9 through 1 through 4. Notice verse 58 on the screen there. It says, "And they cast him out of the city and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul." Now, what's happening here? Stephen is being martyred, one of the men of the faith, and he was a deacon, and Saul was there. Now, as I think about this, I really begin to say to myself, okay, this is a young man. And that's what the scriptures say. They laid down their coats at the feet of this young man. Can you imagine the impression that made on a young person? As we begin to think about our own young people in the back, the things that you do and the things that you say can have a deep impression on them. We call them, the children, impressionable for a reason, because they learn so much from us. And since he was impressionable, notice that he didn't start out as a friend of the church either, Saul, that is, because he was feared by those who did profess faith. But Paul was serving in a leadership role, and he was very excited about this leadership role because he thought he was doing the right thing. So he's a persecutor. Why is that important for us? Notice in chapter 8, verse 3, it says this: "He made havoc of the church." So Saul is doing his best to destroy that which Jesus brought to bring to life. And so he's taking people off, dragging them to jail, committing them to prison, and just really being a persecutor. And in chapter 9 and verse 1, it tells us that he was breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. So again, I can only imagine that, we know as we look at this that Saul is going in the wrong direction. And sometimes you can look at people in your own life, in your own sphere, and you can see they're going in the wrong direction. Well, he thought he was doing a good service. And the religious people of his day, they were very excited about what he was doing. And so he's on a mission. But note that Christ confronts him, and Paul is converted on the road to Damascus, we find in Acts chapter 9. We know the story. And I think it's important that we look at 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9 there, because as we think about Paul, you may have people in your own sphere where you think, how in the world could God ever use them? But notice this: God is what? Long-suffering to us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. We're loved, aren't we? God loves us. Paul was in God's plan. You're here probably because you're part of God. God has a plan for your life, whether you realize it or not. I would think that most of us in the room are Christians. And so understand that if God could reach this man, Saul, who was a persecutor of the church, God can do great things. Because, Saul may have seemed unreachable, but God had a plan. Notice this verse. Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, when asking why or how, it's important for us, how can God use someone? Why would God choose someone? Notice Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9. "My thoughts are not your thoughts." This is God talking. "And my ways are not your ways. They're higher than this. And so it's important for us to understand that God can use people. He uses people like me and like you to reach others for his cause. Well, I think for Paul, for most of us, we know the story. So as Acts chapter 9, verse 3 tells us, as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone round him from heaven. Well, now, you might say, well, if a light shone round about me, I would get saved too. Well, we are the light of the world, aren't we? That's what scriptures say. So we have light shining around us all the time. And so if you've failed to come into contact with that light, then that's the mission of the church, to make sure that you come in contact with that light. Well, is it safe to say that when we encounter Jesus, life changes? It certainly did for Saul. His life would be forever changed because he had, notice I have underlined there that phrase, he had a personal encounter with Christ. Now, you can meet a lot of important people during your lifetime. You can meet the rich, the famous, the politicians, political people. You can meet all these different people. But yet, until you have a personal encounter with Christ, your life, it's exciting to meet those people, but Christ can change your life. And that's so important for us to understand. We're all witnesses to the fact that Jesus changes lives. And if I went around the room this morning and I said, what was your conversion experience like? Well, you might not be able to say, the light struck me down, but you might have a story that's very different. But again, it all brings us back to this idea that Jesus changes people. Well, Saul began preaching the gospel of Jesus as the risen Lord. Now, can you imagine that for a moment? Just think about that. Here is this guy, has warrants as he's headed to Damascus. He's going to take people into captivity for the very thing that we know that he begins to do. And I love what I found in Acts chapter 9, verse 22, because it's so real. It's like, but Saul increased all the more in strength, so, now he's recovering from being struck down. He was blind, and, you know the whole story. But notice this, is it confounded the Jews who dwelt in Damascus, because he's telling them about Jesus as the Christ. It's like, whoa, time out, Paul, or Saul, you came here for this, but you're telling me something different. So can you just imagine for a moment, not everyone is going to be excited about Saul's change. And he needed a Barnabas to help him. It's important for us to realize that trust is a key component in any part of ministry. People have to trust in what you say and what you do. And sometimes it takes a little while to gain that. Sometimes people get frustrated, like, well, I got saved, so I want to, go at it, and I want to get charged up, and I want to do, and we want them to do. But there are some jobs where it takes a little time to build a little bit of trust. And so before you gain those wheels, and that's where we are, I think, with Paul, and because he needed a Barnabas to help him along. Even though he said, hey, I'm following God, I'm preaching about him, and I want you to know about him, everybody wasn't so convinced. And maybe you've experienced some of that as you've moved along as well. Well, what's going to happen with this? Well, on the screen you have the map, and on the right-hand side of the screen we're talking about the area of Jerusalem right now. And so Paul is going to have to move on. He's going to have to find a way to go. And so he's going to go up the right-hand side of that map over into the middle, and he's going to be teaching and preaching about Jesus. He goes to Cyprus, which is the island there. And so, again, it's this pattern of ministry that remained. And so as he goes to new areas, he ministers first to the Jews. And as you read the accounts, it says they went to the synagogues first to minister to the Jews, and then they went out to the community. Very important for us to recognize this. We'll get back to the map in just a moment. Paul's taking the gospel to the Gentiles, and he's planting churches. Remember, I told you, 14 that we know that he planted for sure. Up to 20 is what some commentators would say. He wasted no time. He got busy taking the message to others. His call was to minister. He wanted to minister. He wanted to be this missionary. And as you think about that, that becomes important because the message of the gospel was, moving north. It's moving west. It's it's going to change lives. And what it does tell me is that as you look at this, journey 1 takes him to the island of Cyprus. I'll bring the map back up in just a moment. So he's there, all of a sudden he's off the mainland, and then he's going to move on up to these areas of Antioch, Lystra, and Iconium. And in each of those places, there was opposition to what he was doing. So it wasn't like, okay, it's all going to roll smoothly. I think I've shared with Josh and Eugene about the LifeWise and some of the articles that have been, if you follow Cleveland.com and you follow the Plain Dealer, you understand that not everyone is excited about this, like the church would be excited about this. There are some people who are very against having release time for kids in school. And so you can see that wherever you go to share the message of the gospel, there is going to be some opposition. And so we just need to be prepared for that and ready for that. Well, again, look at the map here. It's in color. And so if you look again at the right side, about where you see the 1, 2, 3, you see that is Antioch. So that's where one of the churches that Paul is responsible for is founded. And as you go a little bit to the middle of the center of the map, you find Iconium and you find Lystra. So he's beginning his ministry into Asia Minor. And so through those 3 churches, we know that he founded, and he did something really, really great. Again, the reality of this is that challenges, opposition, and hardship are going to follow him. The work wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't necessarily going to be welcomed either. And so as you think about that in your service to Christ, just remember, you may not have it like Paul did, and I suspect none of us have it like Paul did, but again, the idea that it's going to be, this smooth road of sharing, that may be a little bit misguided, because there will be opposition. Well, journey number 1, 3 churches. He's moving up that, moving north, moving westward, and then we know that he goes on journey 2. He gets new partners, so again, people partner up with him. Silas and Timothy become partners. And you know the song, right? Send the Light. You've heard the Macedonian call today. So as you read about this account, this is really about where there's this vision that there are these folks from Macedonia, which would be our common day Greece, and they're calling. They need someone to come to them. And so Paul does, doesn't he? And this time he takes Silas and he takes Timothy with him. Again, this idea that he's going to do more ministry, this Macedonian call. And what we find there is, so we've got the 3 churches that we're aware of in this first journey, and now there's 5 that we're aware of in his second journey. Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and Corinth. All of these churches that are being established because of his work and his faithfulness. Well, helping others in their walk's important, isn't it? And hopefully you have someone that you can help along the way and help minister to. Growing these churches with the message of the gospel is something that couldn't be discounted. And I love, if you read the story of the Bereans, they didn't just take Paul at his word. They went back and they researched the scriptures to make sure that he was teaching what the scriptures say. I would challenge all of you to do the same. Whether it's me teaching, Josh preaching, Eugene preaching, whomever you hear preaching, look back to the Word to ensure that the message is being shared properly. Wasn't always easy. At times it was difficult. We remember the Philippian jailer, don't we? He came to Christ because where was Paul and Silas? They were in jail because they were sharing the Word. So again, this idea that life in this journey in Christian faith is going to be easy, not always. There will be times that you'll be challenged and you'll be tested. The key is to understand that God is there with you, whatever you go through. Corinth, again, that church, he spent more time there than, he spent about 18 months there. So if you think about that church and all the things that you read about that church of Corinth and those 2 letters that he wrote back, think about what he was dealing with there and the things that changed after he left. Again, it's very important, and I think any pastor or preacher in the room would tell you that you want your audience or your parishioners to be rooted and grounded in the Word of God. That's what will make a difference in their lives. Well, notice what Timothy says. Again, they're sharing the Word, but in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 3, what do we find Paul writing? Therefore, you therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Well, clearly experience had taught them a few lessons, and they had seen what God had done for them, but they also see, what the world is doing to them, in the time that they're trying to share. So if you get discouraged or disappointed because somehow the message is not going the way you want it to go, just think about Paul and Silas. I don't think you've been in jail yet. I don't think you've been beaten. I don't think you've been stoned, left for dead. Again, I can go on and on and on about all the things that happened to Paul. So this idea that we need to learn this, working with people, sharing the faith, it's an important proposition, isn't it? Well, it can also be difficult, and so just realize that. Anytime you work with people, it can be difficult, but you know what? It can also be very, very rewarding because you share in their journey, and there's nothing quite like that. If you have a friend or a family member that you've helped lead to Christ, it's very meaningful, isn't it? Because you've had a part in someone's eternal destiny. Nothing quite like that. Well, journey number 3, let's move on. So, we're going to Ephesus now. You know that church, and you heard about that. We're going into Asia Minor. Ephesus is one of the churches that we know that Paul was key on. He actually spent 2 years there as he ministered, but opposition followed him. It's like how do you get rid of this? But it was following him everywhere. But he continued to visit churches, and he continued to encourage people in their belief. And he had this power about him. And I would say to you this morning, the scriptures tell us that we receive power, don't we, through the Holy Spirit to minister and to witness to others. Well, as he gets to Ephesus, I want you, now, I don't have the map on the next slide, but I want you to remember the map. So we went all the way to the left side of the map, which was Macedonia, or current Greece, and we're coming back to the middle now for Ephesus, which is Asia Minor, and so that would be like modern-day Turkey. So if you're thinking about how do I get this all together. And now what's happening is Paul is heading back to Jerusalem. So in all of his journey, the message is he is going back to Jerusalem from where he was essentially banned. You remember they wanted to kill him, and he escaped miraculously because some people cared about him and let him down in a basket over the wall. Get out of here because it's not a good time for you to be in Jerusalem. Well, the Jews are not happy about Paul's message, and they made false accusations. They wanted to sidetrack his team's efforts. So every turn that he's going to, it's all about, how do we stop this message? Well, that's a futile attempt, isn't it, to do something? Because we heard this said, if it's of God, remember, we're not going to stop it. And that's someone that was in this sort of tract with Paul and making sure that he people wanted to silence the gospel, but it's not going to happen. Well, again, the journey was marked as they're going back to Jerusalem with rejection and punishment, because they're sharing. And he was going to face hearings at many different levels before the people, before the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, before the governors, Felix, Agrippa, you know those stories, before kings. He was headed back, essentially he was going to go back to Rome. Coming to Jerusalem, but he's going to get shipped back to Rome. And so this idea that he was going to somehow, it would be better for him when he got back to where he was launched wasn't quite so. Well, let me just ask the question, were these God's plans for him? Obviously, we would say. But for some of us, this is probably hard to grasp. You sit back and you think, well, why would God put him through such hardship?